It's minutes after 7 o'clock. Thank you for staying with us this evening on News at Prime. Now, the countdown for the US elections is in full swing, and immigration remains a hot topic for both the Democrats and Republicans. There are 4 days to go until Americans cast their ballot in one of the most hotly contested elections in the US history. As part of Newzroom Afrika's team providing rolling coverage, Ziyanda Ngcobo is at Duke University to speak to South Africans about issues facing the diaspora in that country. She joins us now live for more. A very good evening to you, Ziyanda, or should I rather say, considering the time difference, a good afternoon to you, Ziyanda. What's the mood like, and what are the South Africans who are there saying now, considering that whether it's a Trump or a Harris win, it will have an effect?
Absolutely, and the implications on foreign policy are quite dire. In fact, you know, just off air, I was talking to my guest who I'm going to bring in shortly about how, you know, there's not really much mention of Africa and South Africa in particular when it comes to the election messaging, whether you're talking about Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. But let's bring in Katherine Mavis, who is a South African professor here at Duke University. You've been here for 15 years, and before we get into the work that you're doing as the Concilium of Southern Africa here at Duke University, let's talk about you as a South African working at Duke University and this election. I mean, there's just so much anxiety, in particular here in North Carolina, where the numbers are just so close.
There is a lot of anxiety, and thanks for having me. It's strange to watch it as a South African. I don't vote. So I feel, because I'm not American, so I feel a strange relationship to the sort of levels of anxiety and fear. But what I care a lot about, both personally and in my work, is the ways that Americans talk about and think about and discuss Africa. And it's I've found in my work that it's always Africa, a singular place, so it's very rare that conversations will be about South Africa in particular, or Nigeria, or Kenya, etc. So it's been interesting to see so much discussion in this election about foreign relations, not surprisingly, given that the concerns are about China, about Russia, about the Middle East, about Gaza. But in all of those conversations about whether Harris will, you know, how will Harris affect it or how will Trump affect it, I'm seeing no conversation, no discussion about the continent, about Africa or Africans, whether in the US or on the continent.
And of course, the topic of immigration is still, you know, big in this country. In fact, Trump is, in terms of the language that he's using, illegal aliens, etc. Does that have an impact on you, or do you think it's more got to do with Southern Americans than it does for a South African like you living in the US?
That's a great question. I mean, as a white person, I think the effect is very, you know, is not direct. It's not directly about me. As a professional, I can escape a lot of those kinds of anxieties and fears. I do see it a lot in my classrooms. The last time Trump was elected, hopefully the last time Trump was elected, you know, a lot of my students were scared the day after the election to come to campus, genuinely scared. And that included students from South and Central America, but also included obviously a lot of students from the Middle East and a lot of African students. And I'm lucky because I teach in a program with a lot of students from Africa. But they were genuinely scared to just even be on campus. And just not knowing what would happen because of the language. And as we've seen in the last few years, that language has gotten even worse, uglier, more violent in many ways. So it is certainly in teaching, in working with young Americans and people from all over the world, there's a level of anxiety and stress that is just very difficult to navigate and very sad.
And it seems, as you've already said, it's gotten worse. So as someone who's a professor here, Do you think that it is going to have an impact? I mean, there's just the tension is in the air, quite literally. After November 5, what do you have in mind as you plan now? I mean, is it even going to affect your program in particular? We'll get into the details of your program, but just what you've described about the mood of students.
It will definitely affect us, I think. I think that there are ways in which politics is talked about in this country that makes it more and more difficult to teach the kind of things that we're teaching, which are very critical, not of specific parties or people or institutions, but of the ways that institutions work in this country right now. And more and more they are being undermined in terms of everybody having a voice, in terms of legal protections. They're very loud voices, you know, silencing debate and argument about certain things. And so I think at universities, you know, and we've seen how difficult it has been to navigate real battles over what people believe is right, where universities should be places that we get to talk about these things, debate them. And that's already been undermined, I think, quite substantially. And so it's very scary to see, you know, what I see in my classes is students silencing their opinions or their ideas or their questions. And all we really want them to do is ask questions. And so that's the worst thing for us, really. And once they stop, then it's this kind of dance to sort of get those questions out in the air. So I think it affects us as teachers. Institutionally, it's you know, we see, I think, less and less support for the kind of critical social sciences, social studies, social research that we do. So it gets harder and harder within an institution, even like Duke, that I think is really supportive of these kinds of programs in general. But given the more national and statewide trends, it feels like a battle.
I mean, what you're talking about, maybe not to a large extent, but there are some similarities with the politics in South Africa. If you look at just how immigration was also topical for our general election, porous borders, you know, here you're talking about building a wall. That's what Donald Trump talks about. In South Africa, it's the same with the border with Zimbabwe, for an example. What other similarities do you pick up on as a South African working in the U.S. for 15 years in terms of the language? Because sometimes we feel that these things are isolated, whereas the politics becomes global.
Yes, absolutely. I'm always frustrated in South Africa when the discussion is so much about, this is all about how South Africa and our problems, and often the problems South Africa, I think, faces are global problems. But what I see, the most powerful and frightening similarity I see is, ironically, fear. I think a lot of politics in South Africa is driven by fear. Fear of the other, fear of not having a job, fear of not having a home, very real fears, but they manipulated politically to sort of point the finger at certain people. In the case of South Africa, very clearly immigrants, especially migrants from elsewhere on the continent. And that kind of fear, and it's the fear that I experienced in apartheid South Africa as well, that was supported these kinds of very violent institutions and processes. I hear it more and more here. It feels like I'm in apartheid South Africa in the US right now. The way that fear is mobilized to push people to do and say things and vote for things that are not in their best interest at all, but also produce more fear, produce more violence. And so that is a similarity that is really quite frightening to see, just personally, honestly.
Sure. That's a very pregnant statement, that you feel like you're living in apartheid South Africa. Just lastly, in terms of the work that you do, you're part of the Concilium of Southern Africa here at Duke University, and you look at Americans who visit South Africa. And this election, do you think that's going to have an impact? Of course, just talk us through the kinds of work that you're actually doing within this body.
A lot of my work is on how Americans talk about and perceive and imagine South Africa. So not South Africa specifically, but Africa. And that's not necessarily by my choice. That's because when Americans talk about South Africa, they think they're talking about the whole of Africa, or they just generally, that's what they care about. And I think that is one of the reasons I'm interested in that, in the way that Americans travel and what they learn and don't learn and what they're looking for there, is that it affects deeply, I think, policy, U.S. foreign policy on the continent, because there is such a powerful message that this is a singular place, this massive 52 countries, you know, thousands of languages. There's a perception that you can write policy that's on something they think of as Africa. And so it shuts down questions, it shuts down asking what are people there doing, what are politicians there doing, what is industry doing, and you know, so I think it's a hugely important question for me, and I continue to sort of come back to it, because even as people say, no, we better, we know, there's all this information, there are all these Africans on social media and on the web that I can see and talk to and engage with, I'm not seeing a change based on that in the discourse, the language, the vocabulary used to describe this I would say an imagined Africa. So I think it really, really matters, but it's hard sometimes for people to understand how much it matters. Media, journalists would understand that because it's a story we tell about a place. And the story Americans continue to tell about Africa is that it's a simple, problematic place that's the same everywhere.
15 years later in the U.S. and the narrative still hasn't changed. That's a very interesting. Katherine Mavis, she is a professor here at Duke University, just giving us some insight on her personal experiences as a South African and a scholar working at an Ivy League institution, might I add, in the U.S. But the narrative of Africa really not necessarily changing, but most critical from that interview is that in this election that we're building up to 4 days to go, she has likened it to living in apartheid South Africa, which is quite the statement to be made. Let's leave it there for now. In North Carolina in the United States, stay tuned to Newzroom Afrika, where Masa Kekana will continue with the news just after this.